Hi everyone. Welcome to our next video in the Week 1 series on frequency polygons. A frequency polygon is similar to a histogram in that it is used to represent quantitative data for a single variable. Frequency polygons have two axes, very similar to histograms. The x-axis is now class midpoints instead of class boundaries. And the y-axis is still the frequency, and it can be class frequency or relative frequency. The midpoint is the number halfway between the lower bound and upper bound. To find that, you take the lower bound for a row, add it to the upper bound for that row, and divide it by 2. The graph is called a polygon because once you've drawn it, it will connect to the x-axis at the beginning and end of the graph to form a nice pretty closed figure. And we know closed figures with straight edges in geometry are called polygons. So if you do this correctly, you should end up with a polygon on your graph. The process is going to look a lot like your histogram process with the additional step of finding the midpoint. And then you will need to find the midpoint for one class below your table and one class above your table to close off that polygon. The upside to frequency polygons is it's usually assumed you've done a histogram first, so most of these problems are going to give you a frequency table, or they will ask you to draw a frequency polygon for data in a previous question where you've already built your frequency table. So a little bit less work on this one. So how to make our frequency polygon? You're going to add a column to that frequency table you made for your histogram, and that column is for the calculated midpoints. You're going to use that midpoint formula to fill that column in. So lower bound plus upper bound divided by 2. You're going to then figure out what the gap between those midpoints is, and you're going to use that gap to figure out what one row below the table looks like and what one row above the table looks like. Once that's done, exactly like a histogram, draw and label your axes. X is midpoints, Y is frequency, and plot each point from your table and connect the dots with straight lines. So your table is going to contain points, midpoint, comma, frequency. So X, comma, Y. So this graph is going to be made up of dots and lines, very similar to a line graph, except for those closing edges. Let's go ahead and build one so you can see what that looks like in practice. So the frequency table on the right represents the distribution of calculus final exam scores for a lecture section of 100 students. Use the frequency table to construct a frequency polygon for the exam scores. So first thing, I kind of scan through that frequency table. I see 15 plus 30 is 45, 85 plus 15 is 100. So there are 100 students in this table, and they've given me the class boundaries already constructed and the frequency for each of those classes. So using our step list from the last slide, we're going to start by adding a column to the end of that table. So here's the table as it was given to us. We're going to tack on an extra column for our midpoints. That second step list was to then use the midpoint formula. Midpoint is lower bound plus upper bound divided by 2 to calculate those midpoints. So 49.5 plus 59.5 divided by 2 gives us 54.5. Next one, 59.5 plus 69.5 divided by 2 is equal to 64.5. And as you continue this process, 69.5 plus 79.5 divided by 2 gives you 74.5. And hopefully by this point in the table, you started to detect a pattern in those midpoints. And if I carry out those last two calculations, we see that the gap between those numbers, the gap between 54 and 64 or 64 and 74, is a gap of 10. That gap is how I'm going to do the next step, which is to figure out what one midpoint below the table and one midpoint above the table looks like. So the midpoint that's the next smallest would be 10 smaller than 54.5, which is 44.5. And the midpoint at the upper edge of that graph is going to be 10 bigger than 94.5, which is 104.5. Because those two midpoints don't exist in our table, they're not actually part of our data set, we don't have any data out there, when we plot that start and end point, we are assuming the frequency is 0. Those 2 points are going to close off that figure in the graph. So let's go ahead and take this information and build a graph with it. So here's the frequency table along with our midpoints, and I've labeled my x and y axes. X-axis is now midpoints, and those midpoints represent those final exam scores for that calculus test. And then the y-axis represents frequency. And I can see from my table the biggest number is 40, so I drew my y-axis so that 40 fits on that y-axis. Next step, we're plotting points, not making bars. So that first x value is 44.5, comma 0. No frequency for that number. So that's going to be down here. The next point is 54.5, comma 5. So that's going to be right here. 64.5 and 10. 74.5 and 30. 84.5 and 40. 94.5 and 15. And then that very last one, 104.5 and 0. Our last step is to go back and connect those dots with straight lines. So for frequency polygons and line graphs, we don't want to use curves, nice straight lines. So I did that using a digital ruler, and you can see we get this kind of wonky shape. And if I connect that starting point to that ending point, I end up with a nice pretty closed polygon, which is how the graph got its name. Okay. There's a try it for you guys. I'd like you to pause the video. You're given another distribution representing the US president age at inauguration. And I'd like you to make a frequency polygon for this table. Okay, let's go ahead and look at how that solution is going to play out. So you'll notice on the left, I've got my augmented frequency table with that extra column for midpoints. I used the midpoint formula, so I added 41.5 and 46.5 and divided by 2 and ended up with 44. And then I repeated that formula down the table and notice that gap between rows of 5 between the midpoints. So 5 below 44 is 39, and 5 above 69 is 74. And then just like last time, I plotted that on a graph, data values versus frequency, in this case age at inauguration versus frequency. And much like the histogram video, you can see this one I didn't do by hand. This again has been plotted in Google Sheets. So in Google Sheets, it's a little bit more straightforward for histograms. You're going to make one column with your midpoints, you're going to make one column with your frequency, and you will explicitly need to type in those zeros for the first and last midpoints. And then you highlight the data, and Google will do one of two things. It'll try to build a histogram, or it'll try to build a frequency polygon. If it builds the wrong one, you can go in and change it. Directions for that are posted in Canvas in those Google how-to videos. All right, if you have any questions on how to do any of the calculations for midpoints or how to translate that table into a graph, please let me know. You can reach me via email or text message. That information's on Canvas, or you can drop by my office hours on Thursday evening from 7 to 8 p.m. Look forward to seeing you in the next video.